There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It was a summer night in 1986 when 26-year-old Anita Cobby met friends for dinner in Redfern. Afterwards, the registered nurse caught the train from Central Station at 8:48 p.m. and arrived at Blacktown Station just before 10. Usually, Anita would call her father at the station and he would pick her up. But this night, all the surrounding payphones happened to be out of order. There were also no taxis available at the taxi rank. It was a beautiful, clear night, and Anita decided to walk home. It was 10 p.m. when a gang of 5 men pulled up beside her in a stolen car, grabbed her and dragged her into the vehicle, kicking and screaming. A number of witnesses on Newton Road in Blacktown heard the voice of a distressed young woman and called the police. That night, Lynn, the friend who dropped Anita off at Central Station, was awoken by a terrible nightmare. It was Anita, telling her she was dying. Anita's mother, Grace Lynch, woke the following morning and noticed that her daughter wasn't in her bed. Often, Anita would spend the night at a friend's house if she'd been out late, so Grace assumed they'd hear from her that morning and wasn't too concerned. That afternoon, she received a phone call from the hospital asking if she knew where Anita was because she hadn't turned up to her 1 p.m. shift. It was at this moment that Grace knew something was wrong. Her husband, Gary Lynch, walked into Blacktown Police Station and reported his daughter missing. A young woman who was working there at the time as a constable remembers it. She recalls that at first, no one was too concerned. This was a 26-year-old woman on a break from her marriage who hadn't come home one night. Surely she'd show up. It was the next day that the naked body of a young woman was found in a paddock at Prospect in Western Sydney. Police identified her as Anita Cobby. That police officer at the station, Deborah Wallace, was around the same age as Anita and similar in appearance. The lead detective would choose to do something unconventional in order to find who was responsible for one of the most horrific murders in New South Wales history. His approach would work, and ultimately, it would change the course of Deborah's career. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Deborah Wallace. Deborah is a former detective superintendent who joined the New South Wales Police Force in 1983, starting at Blacktown Station. She gained notoriety early in her career when she was involved in the investigation into the murder of nurse Anita Cobby. A Woman of Force is a book written about Deborah Wallace by Mark Morey. If you scroll down below, you'll find a link to that book in the show notes. It was February the 3rd, 1986, when Gary Lynch walked into Blacktown Police Station and reported his daughter missing. Do you remember the first time you heard the name Anita Cobby?
Yeah, I was in the station that night and it came into report, and I remember the officer taking the report, and I remember the similar comments as you would expect to say, look, she's probably just out with her girlfriends, you know, she'll be home. And I think it was Gary's persistence saying this is not like her though, she would always ring. And so it's that complexity of saying, well, trying to comfort someone who's got a missing daughter, but also saying, well, the reality is she's 26 years old, she's, you know, separated from her husband, she could just be having some drinks with a girlfriend. So it was that trying to calm him, but also having that, you know, we tend to say, well, we've seen this 100 times, so she'll be home, don't worry. So, yeah, I remember that night it came and didn't really gel with me at the time because it was a missing persons report, but it was until the next day when they found the body.
What was your role at the time? Because you were quite young.
Yeah, I'd only been in the cops at that stage just on 3 years. And in those days, you have to stay in uniform and do general duty policing for 3 years. So my role at the time was a general duties officer at Blacktown.
When they did find Anita Cobby's body, which would, become one of the most infamous cases in Australian history, what was the mood and what was the, energy in that police station at the time? Because I can imagine that the race was on to find out who had done this.
So it got a fair bit of publicity I think from early on, it was becoming quite what actually happened. And I think it very quickly was established by the officer in charge, Graham Rosetta, that this murder isn't someone known to the victim. And I think that was the concern, because most murders are committed by people known to the victim, some association, whether it's, it doesn't have to be a family member, but certainly someone who knows the victim. And they're the ones I think that detectives will pretty well look at a whole line of inquiry but then hone it down pretty quickly to where the main line of inquiry. It's those more random type ones, stranger murders, that are really, really difficult. And in fact, the only people that can really help is someone who's out there with that piece of information. I think at the time, the outrage, because it was starting to filter down the trauma that she had gone through fairly quickly. So I think it wasn't just a case of hit and run, which are all tragedies, but I think it was starting to filter through whether it was correct or incorrect information about the brutality that she went through.
And for anyone who might not be familiar with the case of Anita Cobby, what were the signs early on that this wasn't someone who knew her? Because as you say, she had an ex-partner, she was a young woman around the same age as you. What were those signs in those early days that this wasn't, a case of domestic violence or of someone she knew perpetrating this violence?
And it certainly wasn't me, because I was just in uniform at the time. But from, my association then with Graham Rosetta, I think he just had this instinctive knowledge. He was just, and even today, he's iconic. And even today, I look back on my career and if someone says, what was one of your ambitions, it was to be as good as him. I don't think I ever was, but I aimed to do that. But his instinct, I think, told him that. And I think very early, you looked at the situation where she was separated from her husband, and of course you start looking, and very quickly they were able to confirm her husband's alibi. Once that occurred, then it was looking at, well, who else? And I think then they started to have witnesses coming forward, such as, hearing a scream or seeing a car. So I think he then started to say, hang on, it's one of these sort of murders. There was no one else in the frame that she was known to.
And once her body was found, which I believe at the time details were leaked to the media, which I don't think police wanted to happen, was it a story that was picked up by the media quickly? Because we do see in the media now that if it is a stranger or a random attack on a woman, say in a park late at night, those are the stories that do get traction because they're so rare. Was this something that was making headlines, making front pages around the country?
Absolutely. And I think it was a case of Anita being what you would say is your, not polytypical, because I think very quickly they said, oh, she was a Miss Blacktown, she was a nurse. People started to relate to this very kind, genuine sort of typical Aussie girl, I guess, 26 years old, living with her parents, a nurse, separated from a husband, a local beauty queen, attached to Blacktown. So I think that people resonated. And then, of course, as it started to come out that it was technically a kidnapping murder, then people started to think, I think, wow, that could have been me, because I do that. I walk home. That's nothing dangerous. So I think that people put themselves in her shoes very quickly.
And one day, sort of in, I believe, a week or so afterwards, you were sitting there doing the work that you did at the time, and that Graham Rosetta tapped you on the shoulder. What did he ask you to do? I
think he worked out that after about 2 days, it was one of these random type murders, that the information he needed was out there somewhere. And how does he get that? And understandably so, with Graham probably not giving the media a great deal of information because he had nothing. The media, understandably, were starting to say, I think we're going to start to withdraw from this. We've given it a good run for a couple of days. We've put it on the front pages. It's, but how much can we keep running it? And I was in uniform answering the switchboard. In those days, we had these things called Sylvester switchboards, which were things like you see in the movies with cords, and you keep plugging them in, and I'm there just answering the switchboard at the station, Blacktown Police, can I help you? And then Graham just stopped. I think he was going out to the backyard, and I think he was just on his own and just needed some time. And he just stopped and he looked at me and he said, how old are you? And I said, 26. He said, how tall are you? And I said, 5'8". He said, I've got an idea. You come with me. I think Again, not putting words in his mouth, but the way he said it, I think it might have been a bit of a spare of the moment thing, because I think initially the thought was, well, let's do a reenactment because we might be able to get someone on that train that recognised. But being a Sunday, it was a Sunday night, the chances of getting regular commuter people was unlikely. So I think then it was more a case of, we haven't actually done this a lot in an investigation. So if we let the media come along and be part of this, get them into the investigation, that gives us another 5 days to the Sunday. And also I think the timings, he wanted to work out, would I have been at that location when that person, the witness, heard a scream or saw a car? So I think it had a twofold impact. Firstly, to do the media, to keep the media interested, and also to corroborate witness statements.
And so you retraced those last steps. You met with two of Anita Cobby's friends that had been out that night with her. What were they like? Because I would imagine that's enormously traumatic even for them to be kind of relaying that. What was it like meeting those two women?
It was so difficult for them because I think in a way they were running on probably adrenaline, like numb. So, you can imagine they've just lost their best friend. They'd been out with her hours before, and I'm sure, I can't even imagine the devastation that were going through their minds. And then to take me very quickly in those first few days out shopping to buy clothes similar to what she wore, I'm sure they were thinking, we didn't even really think about when you're having dinner with friends. I don't think you scrutinise each other's clothes to that extent, and yet here we were asking them to do as close as they could to recall what she wore. And I think my understanding was they were pretty comfortable with what we picked, which was ballet shoes, like flatties in those days. Ski pants were, a bit of a fashion of the day, and just a white T-shirt. I take my hat off to them because it would have been, but I think they were as passionate. They knew that this was really important and we needed to do this.
And what were those last steps for her that night? What were those steps you took?
Well, I got on at Central Railway Station because that was the last time the girlfriends had seen her. They gave a time of when she got what they thought to City Central, and then we sort of worked out what train she would have caught. So then we let the media come on at City Central, and I think I was a bit, because, I'm 3-year constable, happy to do anything asked of me, particularly by people like, Graham Rosetta. And he didn't give me the full picture because I thought it was really more about, saying to the public, have you seen this person? But then when I get to City Central, there was this media contingent, which was huge. So I'm nervous, thinking I don't want to do anything wrong. And, of course, they were allowed on the train for about 2 or 3 stops. And then he asked them all to leave because we didn't want it to turn into a circus as well. And then got off at Blacktown, and the detectives by this stage, they were on the train with me, and again asking anyone, had they'd seen anything. And then when we got off, Graham was very careful not to have the media at this point, so it was about the timings. Well, actually, it was interesting because the timings were wrong on the first walk, and so the witness's statement didn't actually gel with where I was. And then it wasn't until I think the girlfriends came back and said, actually, we made a mistake. It was actually this time. And then once that happened, the pieces fell in because it was exactly the right timings for when the witness heard the screams, the car tail lights, etc. So I started the walk which they thought that she would have walked. And then just as they approached the place where the screams were heard, where they think she was taken from, they said to me, Deb, we're going to be following, but we just want you to stop at that house number and just stop there because we just want to get a feel for the time of day, the darkness, the lightness, etc. And I think, although I wasn't scared, that wasn't a feeling I had, but I think at those few minutes that I was standing there, a couple of cars drove past, and I remember thinking, wow, she, a week ago there was this young, beautiful girl standing probably in this spot. A car drove past, she probably thought nothing of it. A car pulled up beside her, she probably still thought nothing of it, that someone's just asking directions or whatever. And then in those moments, her life was over because I think the terror that she must have felt from the moment they dragged her into the car till they ended her life. I mean, I suppose you say to yourself, any murder, any violent act of violence is horrible, but did she even foresee what might be coming in those hours they had her? We try to put those things out of our mind of the terror the individual must have felt.
And especially the fact you were so close in age and so close in your own subjectivity, and then you're standing there thinking, this happened not very long ago. I can't imagine what that must feel like. But those images were published and they're still available, and they're very eerie because, you know, you're retracing these specific steps. Did that publicity help, do you think, to kind of stir up more public interest and get more tips? Because the police just needed more information. Did more come in?
My understanding, the crucial thing did the following that. And my understanding is, again, not putting words in Graham's because I wasn't intimately involved in the investigation at that stage. My understanding it did. And whatever that crucial piece of information, I believe that the original one was anonymous. But Graham then turned the investigation onto the 5 killers. And so it was on a matter of weeks later on. In lieu of having no other leads, Graham was able to focus the resources, and then the team were amazing and just dogged determination. And, of course, then the 5 killers were arrested.
Do you recall what it felt like in that station when those killers were just sort of identified? Because, yeah, I can imagine that was obviously an enormous amount of pressure on a police force. Was there a real sense of accomplishment that they had been able to find them?
It was quite a bizarre, and I don't think we've seen scenes like, I certainly haven't experienced scenes like it. I went back after I did the reenactment. Graham had said to me that night in the car park, would you like to stay on the case? He knew that I was only junior, so, you know, I wouldn't have done a great deal except maybe, you know, do errands more or less, and understandably. But at the time, though, there was a period before I did that I went back in to do my uniform duties. And I remember the scenes. I was on duty the day that they were arrested, particularly I think it was the Murphy brothers were being brought in. And the word quickly filtered around. The police had done a number of raids. Well, quickly it went from just, you know, outside Blacktown. So I use the word mob, but they weren't intending to, you know, crash through doors, but the community outpouring of grief was quite bizarre. So the point is then we had to all go out into the front of the police station and do an arm chain with each other to hold everyone back because they were trying to break through to get to the car. And I think at that stage we even had a noose dropped over the courtroom. We were next to a Blacktown court. So even a noose was dropped over the wall. So bizarre scenes. But of course, I can imagine the pressure on Graham's team because these people, you know, are innocent until proven guilty. So we have to give them all the protection, and suddenly you're faced with this people that were running on emotion. So I think they were just letting it all out. So it was quite volatile. Inside the police station, I think you don't know. You've brought people in to be interviewed at that stage. We're a long jump from being suspects in to getting people, you know, convicted. So I think although there was some sort of relief, I don't think the cops ever took anything for granted until, you know, they came back with that guilty verdict.
And that case changed the trajectory of your own career, as you say, because you were offered a different opportunity than you'd initially kind of pursued. How did your career change after that incident?
I was so happy to work in uniform at Blacktown because we had the best bunch of colleagues out there, and there wasn't many women out there in those days. We followed on our role models that had been not frontline women. We weren't integrated into the police force proper until late 70s. And these wonderful women, my predecessors, set this road for us that I was now allowed to embark upon because of them. The guys at Blacktown didn't quite know what to do with us girls, so they treated us with the utmost respect, almost like their daughters or their sisters. So I just had this great time. I was having a great time just being a police officer. And as far as I was concerned, I'm going to stay here forever. And then when Graham made the offer, I wasn't sure, I wasn't confident, but I felt you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. If Graham's asking me to come up, I'll, of course, even if I make coffee or photostat, I don't care. And when I went up there, I saw this sort of really different sort of work, this determination, this dogged patience and professionalism, which I also had seen in uniform. But this, I felt, this is where I think a woman in particular could really make some impact. And for me, as much as I love the front line, I just felt this for me was a better fit.
And there was a quote that is in the book from a mentor of yours about femininity, and it says, "Never compromise your integrity or your femininity. Be true to yourself and be proud to be a police woman. You're not a policeman." What do you think she meant by that?
I think she picked up early on is that her name was Second Class Sergeant Joan Stedman, and she's quite iconic. Everyone knows, Joni, they used to call her. And Joan had been in the original, like the policewomen, because we've been around, over 100 years. But Joan was from, one would say, sort of the old school who, came through, were sort of helping the detectives or did school lecturing. And there was a period where they could transition into the frontline policing. And Joan was keen to do that, but she also didn't want to go out on the truck. She felt, so she was the station sergeant and ran it like a military operation. Like, she was amazing. Cleanest station, I think, ever in Sydney. And I think she just took one look at me, and I think she was just giving me advice that she had earned, that in a way was saying, you be different, like enjoy and celebrate your individuality. Don't just start to be one of the blokes, because you're not. And it was my very first day. But it turns out it was quite good because I was a bit of a girly girl anyway. So with Joan endorsing me, I could then say, oh, good. So when I went into plain clothes, I said, I don't think I'll be plain. So.
You then moved on to work in sort of Cabramatta in the 90s, and it was a real hotbed at the time of drugs and crime. What specifically were the issues that were unfolding there? What was happening? What was sort of the perfect storm that was creating that hotbed?
Cabramatta is a suburb in the southwestern areas of Sydney, and it's actually close to a place called Villawood, which is near Fairfield. Cabramatta in that area tended to take on the face of the immigration policy of the day. So Cabramatta had a lot of, I suppose, transformations over years, because as people would be in the detention centres, they then, as they gradually were released, they then would settle nearby because other relatives might be in the detention centres. And so Cabramatta had gone through a whole change. It's, from a lot of Eastern Europeans and et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, we started to get the wave of refugees out of South Vietnam in particular, some Southeast Asia generally, but particularly South Vietnam. So they settled in Cabramatta, and I have to say we probably got the best of the refugees. I'm probably selfish saying that, because a lot of the people that, of course, I had no papers, but I would find in talking to members of the community who owned restaurants, their background was, I was a molecular scientist and I was a physicist, and amazing backgrounds. They're all academics, and they opened these fantastic restaurants. So this hugely rich culture. But what had happened, there was also what comes with that occasionally is this very vulnerable community, is people that can prey on that vulnerability and the lack of understanding of our laws. And originally, again, it goes back to a street gang that sort of was what I was introduced to. They were known originally as 4Ts, they tell me, in prison camps. And that was because when they were in prison camps, they didn't have families, which often families could only afford to get a boy out, usually the 14-year-old boy, because they felt they had the better chance. They didn't have family to look after them. So in prison camps, the extended people in the prison camp would look out for these boys and sort of look after them. When they then immigrated here or came out of detention centres, again, they didn't have that family network, so they sort of bonded together, and lack of education, lack of language skills, not excusing, it was just understanding them, they became a street gang. And originally they would prey on crimes against their community, which was sort of traditional, like neck chain robberies, because the gold the ladies had was 22 carat gold, quite soft, so you could pull it very easily off their neck and then run to a disreputable jeweller who would melt it down and give them $20. And this process went on, escalated because of the notoriety of them. They're now becoming more established. So they then tore their hand at extortions, and would go into restaurants and say, look, you have to give us $100 a week, and if you do that, then we won't come back to your restaurant and we won't eat here, and good people will come here and not gang members. The community said, well, okay, that's not a bad deal. We're getting security and they're not going to eat here, so good people will come. They saw it as business. And it wasn't until we explained to them extortion, that's actually a crime. And so it took a bit of work to win the community over, trying to explain our laws, particularly our bail laws, because they'd say, we tell you who the boy was, and the next minute he pays you money and you let him out. You're just corrupt like back in Vietnam, not realising that's our bail system. So all of that, we worked through that, and of course the drug dealers and the gang members got smart. They went, we've got to move away from victims because victims are telling the cops and we're getting arrested. So let's try our hand at something else. And there was drug dealers above them, higher level, who said, well, now I need people to distribute, and they were a willing army of distributors.
And a willing army, I suppose, as well, because, you know, there might not be as many opportunities if you haven't had the best education, or you can see why that's something that someone would be drawn to, I suppose. And what was the drug at the time that was sort of particularly profitable or, you know, central to Cabramatta at the time?
The main drug that was doing the harm at the time from a big perspective was heroin. And, of course, the Cabramatta heroin, because of the networks available to, you know, the higher, you know, drug dealers, was that they could get almost pure heroin. So what would happen is that the King's Cross in that era was probably the biggest drug market that people sort of recognised. And then suddenly we knew that there was certainly a lot of heroin dealing. And we had a small group of detectives at Cabramatta. And it was sort of in a way, the community were really tolerant of the level of dealing going on because it was quite small. Most people that came to Cabramatta that knew about the heroin there were, you know, from the surrounding areas, you know, Liverpool, Blacktown, Mount Druitt, you know, Campbelltown. And then the government gave us some money, which was good because we wanted to find out what is our heroin like compared to the King's Cross heroin. And we found out that the Cabramatta heroin was half the price. So it was $50 in King's Cross, selling for $25 a deal in Cabramatta, and that the King's Cross heroin was around 15%. The Cabramatta heroin was pretty pure. So we thought, oh no, I hope no one finds this out because they'll all come here and the community's facing enough. And suddenly I remember the turning point was in the mid-90s when there was an article called the Smack Express and sort of publicised the outcome. I don't know who gave those figures out. I would never know. I was a young constable. But suddenly all roads led to Cabramatta. So now, you know, the community's faced with everyone just about, you know, it seemed like New South Wales making their way to Cabramatta. And when they found out how cheap the heroin was, they didn't want to sort of have to come back that many times, the fact of getting picked up by the cops. So they would then think, oh, wow, I've only got enough for 2 deals, but if I do a bag snatch, I can get extra money to buy more heroin. So it was this sort of, there's now this small, you know, community is now facing, you know, another torrent of criminal activity from for want of a better word, outsiders.
Tell me about meeting Father Chris Riley and what his approach was to that issue.
It was a sort of like in the mid-90s, so a couple of things happened that was a sort of turning point again for me. I was now a young sergeant. We had the murder of our political assassination of John Newman, the local member, by a political rival, Fourneau. And also we had the murder of Tree Min Tran, who was the leader of that 5T gang. So that was almost like everyone's going, oh no, is it a rival gang? I think very quickly we'd established, we never proved it. There was no one ever charged for his murder, Tree Min Tran's murder, but it was sort of viewed by us that it was an inside job for a whole range of reasons. So we knew it was never going to be another gang coming in, you know, reprisals, and I think the gang themselves knew that, but they were sort of a bit all over the shop. And I think my boss at the time was the chief superintendent in the region, and I think he was under, you know, speaking again, I don't really know what was happening up the food chain, but I can imagine the pressure. And suddenly he said to me, I'm going to set up a gang unit in Cabramatta, and I think that was controversial in itself because it was the old using the word Cabramatta gang squad was sort of saying, yes, we have gangs here in Cabramatta and I'm going to address them. And that for me was a watershed moment for me because I'm a young sergeant running a proactive team, and he put me in charge of this gang squad, which was my first probably introduction to actually focusing on gangs. My charter was simply, he's a man of few words at the time, to disrupt and disable, and that's the first time I'd heard those words, the criminal activities of the 5D gang and the drug trade in the Cabramatta area. I thought, oh, really?
Do they tell you how to do that, or is it sort of like come up with your own strategy, here's what we need you to do? And
I think that was part of Mr. McKinnon's strategy is we've tried everything else. Like we've arrested our way. You know, the amount of arrests that went on in Cabramatta was outstanding, yet they were still there, and because they were, you know, a bit like the revolving door, because it was hard to get victims to go to court, and certainly users aren't going to give up their supplier. So he sort of gave me a blank check in a way, but I didn't really know what to do with that.
No.
So I went up to the gang members who we had this very strange relationship in a way for cops to have. It wasn't what you'd call mutual respect at all, but it was an understanding in that, you know, and they said, we do the crime, we do the time. So we'll just go to jail and then we'll come back out So I went to them and told them about my brand new job, and they laughed a bit when I told them what they had to do, and then they said, but we'll give you some help because we think you're a bit dumb. Thank you. And they spoke really interestingly. This is the first time I'd had this really deep and meaningful conversation. They said, look, we're now a snake without a head. We are quite weak, but very soon one of us will become the new head. And so you are best to attack us while we're vulnerable. And he said, 3 things will happen to us. We will get killed. That's the life of a gang member. We will go to jail because that's your job to lock us up. But if we beat the other 2, then we hope to grow up and grow out. They said, but we may do that. But there's a whole group coming through behind us who are younger than us, who have no education, very little language, English skills. And that's the ones coming through. So, Madam, they used to call me Madam, you may mow the lawn, but you need to cut the weeds. I'm thinking, I've taken this back to the station going, so how do I do this? And I didn't know, and I was thinking, scratching my head, and I got a call from Father Chris Riley out of the blue, and he said, look, I think I can help you with your street youth. And I was a bit, I don't know what I was thinking. I said, street youth, Father? Street youth? We don't have street youth. We have machete-wielding killers. And I think he just must have thought, oh, she's a belter. But he said, let me come out and meet them. And I went, oh, okay. So he came out and he said, in his matter-of-fact way, I'm not interested in talking to you. I want to talk to them. So he went up to the street and we approached them in their coffee shop, this outdoor coffee shop. He said, Madam, who have you brought with you? And I said, oh, Father Chris Riley. Well, I was Father would scowl at me now. And they said, is that your father? And I said, I looked at Chris, I thought, I just shook his head and I went, no, he's a priest. And they said, oh, like God? And I said, yeah, like God. They said, oh, Father, have a seat. They got this seat and they wiped it down because it had been raining. And I said, oh, hang on, what about me? I've known you longer than him. And they said, oh, Madam, you just sit there. And then he just said matter-of-factly and said, I believe that you have told Madam here that you want an education. And they said, yeah, but not for us, we're done for, but the younger group. And he said, all right, if you're serious, then you be here 3 days a week, 3 hours a day. But while you're here, and she will be here with me, there's to be no crime in this area, no drug dealing. He said, I'll pack up and go. He said, it's in your hands. And they agreed to those conditions. And so we did that for over a year.
And how did it go? Was it successful? Was it complicated?
Complicated is not the word. Yeah, the senior members, it was interesting because they then started to see the junior members starting to do this. They were great at maths. And I used to say cynically to Father, yeah, they're great at maths because they go 1 ounce cut down, how many times purity? You go, stop being a cynic. But it was all good fun. But we were doing really well. They were there and they were starting to – we had volunteers come in, Father's volunteers, came in and sat down with them as well and helped do one-on-one teaching with them. And we'll go – and there was only about 7 of them at that level. And so they were going really well. And then sometimes we're our own worst enemies. We had an operation going tandem to the stuff that my little gang unit was doing, which was strongly proactive arrest and charging. They came in with a proactive strategy of just uniform police to saturate the area, not knowing. And again, I'm not critical of any strategy. You've got to try anything. But the people who came up with it didn't understand the complexities of the environment. So what to the community, although they were trying to help the community, looked worse because suddenly you've got all of these uniform police and they were given fairly strict instructions to walk 3 streets. So the drug dealers are fairly flexible, so they said, we'll go 4 streets. But now they're in residential areas. So now you've got the impact of people in community homes, in units, with people unconscious on their doorsteps, syringes everywhere. It was horrible. But of course, police didn't necessarily want to be there. They had no buy-in to the community. They were just told, turn up at Cabramatta and walk the streets. Not very probably, people from, say, Manly Beaches who were walking the Corso probably don't want to be in Cabramatta, especially in summer. So it was one day and after we'd finished, Father and I packed up, and one of the things we never gave up was how good our camera coverage was, because dealing with gangs, I had to very protect myself and Father as well. So we made sure we were always under cameras so no one could allege anything. The Royal Commission was around that time as well. So we'd packed up, and the junior members were still there doing school. And a couple of people from this uniformed operation walked up to them and said, oh, by the way, we've been watching you on cameras. And they just looked and said, oh, we know there's cameras. And they said, no, what you don't know is that we can hone in on the cameras to you, and we know that you got number 6 wrong. You don't even know how to add up, or words to that effect. To the gang members, it was now we've been betrayed. We've betrayed them. And because it was, sort of a no-go, a crime-free zone, which was, a sort of a safe zone, I guess. So they packed up and said, we're now going to the pool hall, and if you want to teach a school, you need to come to the pool hall. And I said, well, I can't go to the pool hall because it's behind closed doors. And Father said, well, I'm not going without her. So we had this lull. What were we going to do? And in that time, those junior members thought, well, we'll just follow our brothers. And they did an armed robbery. They weren't very good at it and they all got caught, which was an interesting moment because they were taken to Lidcombe's Children's Court, and I rang father and said, they've been arrested. And he said, well, I was angry because I thought all that trust we'd put in them and we're going so well, and not in the cops. I was angry at them that, you turned straight away. And father said, don't be angry, it's an opportunity. And I said, oh, how do you work that out? He said, because now I've got leverage. He said, your job is to tell the senior members not to interfere and to leave it to us. And if they agree to that, then I will do my best to talk to the magistrates at the Children's Court to release them to my custody, and I'll take them to the Southern Highlands to East Farms, and I'll continue their education. We did. And of all those 5 that we took down there, not one returned to criminal behaviour.
What did you learn having that contact and that quite deep engagement with these young men that, as you say, can have extremely tense relationships with the police? What did you learn from, I suppose, having that shared humanity and seeing them in a situation where they might be a little bit more vulnerable?
I learned something that they told me. If you don't listen in the world of policing, then you're stupid, because some of the best ideas come from the most bizarre places, junior officers, gang members. And they said, you know what, you can't beat us unless you understand us. And it was another thing that at the time my boss, Mr. McKinnon, had given me a book called Sun Tzu, The Art of War, which is very, not easy reading, but it said much the same thing about battling your enemy. It's actually a leadership book. And so taking that at the time, thinking about that, I've then taken that right through my career and taken to understand the operating environment which I'm entering. So I think what that taught me is I had to understand what were their needs before we could then come up with our strategies.
When you were working in Cabramatta on that sort of work, and especially with the kind of gang community, you found yourself listening to the radio one day and overheard Alan Jones use your name. What was he saying? What sort of criticism was he pointing at you?
Just to put some context for you, I had stayed at Cabramatta for past the time with Father Riley. The kids had moved on and I was still doing my drug operations. Gang squad had been changed. Mr. McKinnon went off to do the security for the Sydney Olympics. He was in charge of that. So I still was determined to stay there and continue in a more of a not so much gang related, because the 5T, through some good police work from specialist police, came in as well. So I then focused back on the drugs. And so we were doing drug operations, and a whole lot of things happened that as a result of some allegations that people had wrongly made against me, which I was able to clarify to the Royal Commission. I think they must have thought, we've gone through like a dose of salt, so we're going to offer a position at the new Internal Affairs that was being set. I went off to Internal Affairs for 18 months. While I was away in that period of, say, 98, 99, something had happened at Cabramatta, and I don't know, there was a whole parliamentary inquiry about, the subject of the parliamentary inquiry was mismanagement, police mismanagement. And I like how, it was police's fault. There's a whole lot of things going on. And I remember thinking, I'm glad I'm not there now. But in the year 2000, I was promoted to chief inspector, and the Olympics had just started, and I was asked to go back to Cabramatta in an over-ranked position and just have a look at what was happening, because there was this whole lot of politics going on inside the police station, and the community were being sort of, in a way, 130 great cops just wanted to do their job, but in any organisation, without strong leadership or direction, cops don't know, are we allowed to do that? Someone needs to set the direction, and I think that for whatever reasons, I think senior management and middle management were in debate with each other. So all these other cops were just waiting for someone to lead them. So as a result of that, I went back and we had a new region commander called Clive Small, who was known for the backpacker murders, Ivan Malat. I had a new boss in a commander called Frank Hansen, who was fabulous community-minded. So that left me to engage with the police at the station and the community and to come up with some tactical plans. As a result of that, there was a place for everyone, but I think when you start to disempower people, even though you're not meaning to do that, you're just saying there's a role for all of us here, but we have to work together. But that sort of takes people with perhaps agendas, makes them feel disempowered. And so that became a subject, I guess, of if we get rid of Wallace, then, we can reclaim our territory, I guess. It was only one or two or a couple, but they had very influential positions within the police station. And I have to say there were some amazing sergeants there. And there was that middle rank of sergeant who were very influential in any command, whether they're, association, but some of those sergeants were fantastic, great. There was only a couple. It was a situation where one of the things we had was to rebuilding confidence of our senior team with our troops. So one of the things we insisted on, that when you come into the station in the morning, you don't go up to upstairs where, the senior officers sit. You must come through the station and you engage with the station staff who've been there all night and get what happened overnight, engage in some banter. Frank had a really good message in that no senior management was to use a phone. If you wanted to talk to someone, you go down, you walk to the person so that you pass people in the corridor. And, of course, it's a very complex story. Needless to say, I think some people felt if we get rid of Wallace, we can go back to the way we were, we can be in control. It was simple as a parliamentary inquiry was given some evidence by an officer who said that there was gangs in schools. And when he was asked by one of the people on the committee about, have you got evidence of that, he said, well, yeah, there's a police report, we call them cops entries. So a police report, a formal report of an incident at Cabramatta High School where the teacher or the principal was assaulted by gang members. Well, you can imagine the media going, oh my God, that's terrible. And this is given that day. And of course, the principal of Cabramatta High is confronted by this media contingent. It's going, are you all right? What happened? We were assaulted by gang members. He's going, what are you talking about? We had a football game and it was rival school and there was a bit of, argy-bargy, but I told them to leave and off they didn't come assault me. They were just being, the old school sort of fight going on. But he rang Frank Hansen, the commander, and said, I don't know what your police report says. I've had to give information to my Department of Education and we're in conflict here because these weren't gang members, so I don't know what your report says. So Frank asked me to look up the system, see what was that incident, and it's described by the principal as young Asian male, so no mention of gang, and on our reports you have an associated factor that you have to tick, like is it alcohol-related, domestic-related, and two of the factors are, is it gang-related, if you have to tick it, or is it weapons, and none of those were ticked. So I went back and said, well, it doesn't appear that's right. So the principal said, well, I want that clarified. I want you to put down they were actually students from another school because that's what my report says, and I want it clarified. I don't want it sitting out there like this. So Frank, we talk about, old dogs, new tricks. He couldn't work the system. So he said, can you just change it? I said, no, you can't change it because it's for the integrity of the process. All you can do is add something. So all I could do is add something else to say, further information's been received from the principal, Mr. Cabramatta High. It was actually this, and this. Now, someone who obviously, and it wasn't Mr. Jones, he doesn't have access to a police system, but someone has then said to him, this is what she's done. And I feel, in a way, sorry for Mr. Jones because he doesn't know our systems. He's relying on people and probably put a bit of trust in some misguided trust perhaps. And so he's come on and said that I've gone in and changed a cops entry to hide the fact there's gangs in Cabramatta. I mean, I've been working gangs in the area for years. Well, you can't do it. It is, it's
impossible.
Impossible to do it. So I let it go. So that was the start. And I think then the people that were feeding him felt they had probably a compassionate ear that, okay, well, we'll go on a roll. And I think, because I was at the station and saying hello to the station staff and they said, Boss, you just got mentioned on the radio. And I said, he's going to come back after the news break and talk more. And I thought, maybe it's doing a great job. Yeah. And suddenly it was, this woman, oh my God. Even today, all those years, so it's 20 years on, and I still don't hold, in fact, my dad was a constant listener at the time, the 2UE, Mr. Jones, and I remained one and I watch him on Sky, so it's certainly not, I have no issue at all. It was more, and I believe I know who they are. They know who they are. And I suppose they have to live with their own conscience that they tried to use probably an innocent agent to destroy the career of one of their colleagues.
The insults at times became personal. Did that hurt? Did you find that was difficult being, it's one thing when things are being said about you that are untrue, that hurts. And I understand that you're going, well, he's not saying that, it's someone else. And how is he able to verify or not verify that information? But when it becomes quite personal, was that difficult to deal with?
Yeah, and I think it was a personal. I think the difficulty I had was, and I think there was another suggestion, and Mr. Jones would have known this, that they were looking at another police unit about some drugs in sport or something, and it was about, let's talk about drugs because this woman worked at Internal Affairs, and I think there was a unit in Internal Affairs coming under some scrutiny for whatever. It wasn't where I worked, and I'd long gone from there, but there was that parallel, and I thought, he would have known that someone's fed him even that. That's even the case. And it wasn't until a barrister contacted me and said, Deb, just to let you know, because we'd had many court cases against each other and I'd won every one. I was very proud of that. And he said, but, Deb, there's nothing, your luck's going to run out, because being a police officer, you've got to have integrity, but also the perception of integrity. So if I start asking you questions in the witness box about what's being said publicly, you're going to say it's not true. But then I'm going to say, well, what are you doing about it? And you're going to say, well, nothing, it'll blow over. And then people, juries are going to think there must be something in this. And it wasn't until I was thinking about that and a young constable walked past me on the stairs and he said to me, hi, boss. And I said, oh, hi, John. And he said, are you okay? And I went, yeah. And he said, you're not going to be sacked? I said, what am I going to be sacked for? Thinking, what do you know? And he said, because you changed the computer. And I said, John, can you change the computer? He went, no, you can't change the computer. You cannot. And I said, so how did I change the computer? He said, oh, you didn't. I said, no, you can't. And he went, oh, good. Okay, I'll see you later. But I thought, if one person who knows the system, if that keeps going, how am I going to stand up in courtrooms, and honestly tell the truth, knowing maybe they think that I'm
because
corrupt?
There's no counter narrative out there of your story. So did you not feel compelled at the beginning to defend yourself, but was that something that increasingly you felt as though they had to know that this wasn't true, not only to the public, but to the people you were trying to gain the trust of?
I felt it would blow over. I just felt in time, if I just weather the storm, we all have to take hard knocks. We have to take criticism and it'll fade out. And I think it possibly would have. It would have been a one-off comment and then everyone goes, oh, yeah, you can't do that. That's just a comment. Except whoever was feeding him kept feeding him. So it went on to the point that I had to instigate proceedings just to give and encouraged by my staff who were saying to me, you've got your full support. So I knew that the rank and file were supporting me. And I thought, if they're prepared to stand up in meetings and verbally say, there was votes of confidence in Frank and I as their management team. So I thought, if they're verbalising it, then I have to do it as well.
No, exactly right. When you look back at your career, which this book has obviously, made you do, look back at everything you've achieved, what would you say is your most overwhelming or key achievement? What's the thing you're most proud of when you look back at your career?
I think that I'm most proud that I had finished after 36 years, and unfortunately colleagues aren't able to say this through a whole range of traumas that they go through. But I think I'm most proud of that I went on my own terms and I marched out of the academy the same way I came in. And I think I'm most proud that I had fantastic support right through that career from my bosses. I was able to get opportunities from my bosses, so I was very thankful that I was able to walk out the same way I walked in.
And what does retirement look like for you? What does the future look like?
It looks pretty good. I've taken it to like a duck to water. I had a little break, as you do, go to aqua aerobics and, yoga classes. But now it's time I very much love the community. I love serving it as I did in the COP. So I want to serve the community, but today I'm doing it in a volunteer capacity. So I'm delivering Meals on Wheels and I'm involved in the local community club, it's that sort of stuff. So, yeah, and of course I have the wonderful memory to Grace Lynch, Anita Cobby's parents. I'm involved in the building of Grace's Place, which is the first of its kind in the world, treatment and rehabilitation centre for children, or trauma centre for children between the ages of 3 and 15 who have faced, the results of homicide. So that's another legacy of love in memory of Grace.
That's incredible. Well, thank you so much for your time and thank you for your service. It clearly continues.
Thank you so much.
True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Our producer is Lem Zakaria. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.